Imagine you're born. You take your first breath. You open your eyes for the first time, and in the next 9 days, your entire fate. Life or death is decided by one person, not a king, not a judge, your father. In ancient Rome, a father had a power called patria potestas, the power of life and death over his children. When a baby was born, it was placed on the ground. The father either picked it up, which meant you live, or he walked away, which meant you don't. This wasn't considered murder, it wasn't illegal, it was just Tuesday. Historians estimate that in ancient Rome, up to 20 to 40% of all newborns were abandoned or exposed, left outside to die. And Rome wasn't even the worst offender. Almost every ancient civilization did this. Greece did it. Sparta literally had a committee of elders who inspected every baby. If the child seemed weak or deformed, it was taken to a cliff at Mount Taygetus and thrown off. This wasn't seen as cruelty. It was state policy. Aristotle himself said, "No deformed child shall live." China abandoned girls so systematically that it affected entire population ratios for centuries. India threw babies into rivers as offerings. The Aztecs sacrificed children by the thousands. And in medieval Europe, a baby born with a birthmark might be called a demon child and killed before sunrise. Tonight, we're going inside this world because understanding it changes how you see almost everything about human history. To understand why this happened, you first need to understand something about ancient families that is almost impossible to imagine today. In Rome, children were not people. Legally, they were property. The father owned them the same way he owned his furniture or his goats. This wasn't unique to Rome. In ancient Greece, the father had absolute authority, kyrios. In ancient China, Confucian law demanded total obedience to the patriarch. In many ancient societies, a child's right to exist literally depended on whether the head of the household decided they were worth the resources. And resources were the real issue. Ancient life was not like modern life. Food wasn't guaranteed. A drought could kill half a village. Having too many children meant everyone ate less. Having a child who couldn't eventually work the farm or fight in wars felt like a death sentence for the whole family. The Roman writer Seneca wrote matter-of-factly, "We slaughter a fierce ox, we strangle a mad dog. We drown even children who at birth are weakly and abnormal." He wrote this not as horror but as common sense. That's how normalized this was. But here's what most people don't know. Abandonment was not always death. Sometimes it was something stranger, more complicated, and in some ways darker. Because what happened to children who survived? That's where the real story begins. In ancient Rome, there were specific places where unwanted babies were left. One of the most common was the base of the columna lactaria, the milk column, in the forum. Babies were left there because wet nurses and slave traders knew to check. It was basically an open-air drop-off point for human beings. In Egypt, letters have been found from ancient Roman times, real letters from real people. One letter from around 1 BC reads, "If you deliver a child before I return, if it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, throw it out." It was written casually alongside notes about grain payments and household expenses. Girls were abandoned far more often than boys. In ancient Rome, historians believe more than one daughter was practically never reared, even in wealthy families. Boys could become soldiers, heirs, workers. Girls required a dowry, a huge financial expense when they married. To a poor family, a daughter was a debt you'd have to pay someday. In Greece, the situation was similar. Archaeological digs have found mass baby burials, not graves, just pits, at sites, including one famous well in Athens that contained the remains of over 450 infants and fetuses, mostly female. This was not a cemetery, it was a disposal site. But the most shocking destination for many abandoned children wasn't death, it was slavery. Slave traders actively patrolled the drop zones. An abandoned baby was free merchandise. You could pick it up, raise it cheaply, and sell it at full price years later. Historians call this threptoi, in Greek, foundling slaves. Children nobody wanted became property for someone who did. Sparta takes this to another level entirely. In Sparta, the child didn't even belong to the parents. It belonged to the state. Every single newborn was brought before a committee of elders called the Gerousia. They examined the baby physically. Strong baby, you live. Weak baby, the state decided what to do with you. According to Plutarch, weak babies were taken to a place called the Apatheteae, a chasm near Mount Taygetus, thrown into a ravine, not buried, not grieved. The idea was that if nature made you weak, you were a burden the city couldn't afford. To Spartans, this was not cruelty, it was efficiency. But here's an interesting contradiction. Modern archaeologists have found almost no infant bones at that site. What they did find were adult human bones, likely executed criminals. So either the stories were exaggerated or the bodies were removed. Either way, the idea of the practice was so powerful that it became a defining myth of Spartan identity, a society that prized strength above kindness. Children who survived Sparta's inspection didn't get to relax. At age 7, boys were taken from their mothers and put into the agoge, a brutal military training program, deliberately underfed, so they'd learn to steal food, beaten regularly to toughen them. If you cried, you were shamed. The goal wasn't to raise a child. The goal was to forge a weapon. Spartan girls had it slightly different, but no easier. They trained athletically, running, wrestling, throwing, because a strong mother made strong babies. In Sparta, even women were assets of the state. The emotional cost of this system was enormous. Who bonded with infants only to have them taken, or who were never allowed to bond at all, is a psychological wound history barely records. In ancient China, the practice of abandoning female babies was so widespread, so systematic, and so culturally accepted that it shaped the entire population of the country for thousands of years. This wasn't a fringe behavior. It was woven into the economics, philosophy, and daily life of Chinese society. The core reason was economic. Boys carried on the family name, worked the land, performed ancestor rituals, and supported aging parents. Girls married into another family, taking resources out of the household and costing a dowry on the way out. In a society where starvation was always one bad harvest away, daughters were financially terrifying to poor families. Female infanticide in China became so normalized that a famous phrase emerged: raising a daughter is like watering someone else's garden. The implication was brutal. You do all the work and someone else gets the harvest. This mindset persisted not just in ancient China, but for thousands of years into modern history. The numbers were staggering. Some estimates suggest that in certain provinces of ancient China, for every 100 boys, there were only 60 to 70 surviving girls. The imbalance was so severe it caused actual social instability, not enough women to marry, which fueled kidnapping, forced marriages, and trafficking across regions. The consequences of abandonment rippled for generations. But not all abandoned children died. Some were found by Buddhist monasteries, one of the few institutions in ancient China that would take in unwanted children regardless of gender. Buddhist monks believed in the dignity of all life. They ran informal orphanages inside temple grounds, raising foundlings as servants, monks, or craftspeople. Without meaning to, religion became the ancient world's first child welfare system. For the first 1,000 years of European history after Rome, the system of dealing with unwanted children was essentially leave them outside and hope for the best. But in the 8th century, something changed. Cities in Italy, Milan, Florence, Rome opened the first foundling hospitals, not churches, not orphanages in the modern sense. Purpose-built buildings designed to receive abandoned children. The most brilliant and heartbreaking invention was called the Ruta dei Trovatelli, the wheel of the foundlings. It was a rotating wooden drum built into the wall of the hospital. A mother could place her baby in the drum, ring a bell, and turn the wheel. The baby silently rotated inside the wall. On the other side, nuns picked it up. The mother never had to be seen. No questions, no judgment, just a child who could live. These wheels spread across Europe. Florence's Ospedale degli Innocenti, built in 1419, became the most famous. Its name literally means Hospital of the Innocents. Over the centuries, it received tens of thousands of children. It still exists today as a museum and UNICEF research center. What began as an emergency solution became an institution, but the system had horrifying mortality rates. Inside these early foundling hospitals, disease spread easily. Wet nurses were in short supply. Up to 80 to 90% of foundlings in some institutions died before age 5. The wheel didn't guarantee life, it just changed the location of death from a street corner to a crib. Despite this, the hospitals changed something important in the culture. They gave people an alternative to exposure, a choice that wasn't keep the child or kill it. And slowly, over centuries, that choice reshaped how society thought about unwanted children, not as waste, not as property, but as a problem that institutions, not just fathers, had a responsibility to solve. In ancient India, the practice had its own specific shape. The most common fate for an unwanted child, especially a girl, was the Ganges River. The river was sacred, holy, the source of life, and into it parents threw newborns, not out of hatred, often out of poverty, religious belief, or the crushing weight of a caste system that made certain births a permanent curse. The caste system created a specific horror. Children born outside of caste rules, illegitimate children, intercaste children, children of widows, were considered socially contaminated. Keeping them could destroy a family standing entirely. In a world where your caste determined your ability to eat, marry, and survive, social death was as real as physical death. What's remarkable is that the British colonial government, upon encountering this practice in the 19th century, tried to ban it and largely failed for decades. Local officials reported that in some villages, female infanticide was so deeply embedded that it was considered a mercy, sparing a daughter from a life of poverty, forced marriage, and suffering. The belief wasn't we don't value girls. It was, we love our daughters too much to watch them suffer. That's a devastating sentence to sit with. In some regions of India and Nepal, twins were considered an evil omen, a sign that the mother had been unfaithful or that supernatural forces were at work. One twin, sometimes both, would be killed or abandoned immediately. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the same belief existed. The world over, whatever humans couldn't explain, they feared, and what they feared, they abandoned. The British eventually passed the Female Infanticide Prevention Act in 1870, but laws don't change beliefs overnight. The practice continued in hidden forms for decades. Even today, sex-selective abortion and female infanticide remain documented in parts of South Asia, a thread stretching unbroken from ancient times to the present. The past is never as far away as we think. In Mesoamerica, the story takes a completely different turn, not quieter, but louder and more deliberate. The Aztecs didn't just abandon unwanted children. They organized the killing of children as a religious ritual, on a scale that shocks even modern historians. This was not a last resort, it was a ceremony. The rain god Tlaloc demanded child sacrifices, particularly the tears of children, because tears resembled rain. Children, often very young, often still infants, were selected for sacrifice at specific calendar festivals. Archaeological discoveries at the Templo Mayor in Mexico City have confirmed this. The bones of hundreds of children, many aged 2 to 7, with evidence of ritual killing. What makes this particularly chilling is the selection process. The children chosen were often specifically those who cried the most during the selection. More tears equals better rain offering. Parents who gave up their children for sacrifice were considered to be making the ultimate gift to the community. Grief was proof of value. The harder it hurt, the more the gods would be pleased. The Inca civilization had similar practices. The Capacocha ceremony involves selecting the most physically perfect children, usually 10 to 15 years old, sometimes younger, to be sacrificed at the summits of high mountains. Their frozen bodies have been discovered by archaeologists in the Andes, perfectly preserved, dressed in their finest clothes. Some had been drugged with chicha beer beforehand. They went quietly into the cold. To a modern mind, this is monstrous. But to an Aztec or Inca parent, it may have felt like the deepest act of love, giving your child to the gods to save the community from drought, famine, or disaster. The line between sacrifice and devotion was paper thin. This is what happens when the survival of the many is placed permanently above the rights of any individual, a calculation ancient societies made every single day. But not every abandoned child died. Some survived, found and raised by strangers. And the stories of who those strangers were and what they did with those children reveal something surprising about human nature, even in the most brutal eras. In Rome, some abandoned children were taken in by alumni, essentially informal foster children. Wealthy Roman families sometimes raised foundlings as household members, not slaves. Inscriptions on Roman tombs show deep affection to my beloved alumnus who lived 5 years and brought joy to our home. Even in a brutal world, individual humans resisted the coldness of their system, became entertainers. Romans loved child performers, acrobats, dancers, musicians. Abandoned children were trained young and were considered especially talented because they'd been shaped entirely by their trainers, with no competing family loyalties. Some became genuinely famous. Some became the court favorites of emperors. The same society that threw them away could also celebrate them. In some cases, foundlings rose to extraordinary heights. The Roman Emperor Diocletian was likely born to a freed slave family of the lowest social class. Sargon of Akkad, one of the world's first empire builders, according to his own legend, was placed in a basket and thrown in a river as an infant, then found by a gardener who raised him. Moses, Romulus, and Remus Oedipus. The myth of the abandoned child who becomes great is one of the most universal stories in human history. There's a psychological reason why this myth is so universal. It speaks to something deep in human anxiety, the fear of being unwanted, of being the child nobody chose. And its inversion, the abandoned child who becomes a king, is the ultimate wish fulfillment. Every culture created this story independently, which tells us something important. The pain of feeling unwanted is one of the oldest human feelings in existence.